She was talking to me about the Book of Enoch. She goes, "You ever read that?" And
But
I was
that's
like,
not
"No."
included in the canonized.
Here's why: because of rabbis.
Most people have never heard of the Book of Enoch. That alone is strange.
Book of Enoch. Enoch is a very minor character in the Bible. The mysterious thing about him is it says Enoch walked with God and he was no more because God took him.
Because it was almost certainly read by Jesus, quoted by his disciples, and treated as sacred scripture by one of the oldest Christian churches on earth.
When they found those clay tablets, the Book of Enoch was in there, along with the Book of Isaiah.
Researchers just ran it through Grok AI.
Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system. And let me be very, very clear. This is a moment where promise and peril are going to collide.
What came back has unsettled scholars and restarted a conversation that was closed over 1,600 years ago.
For a book that was so popular for ancient Jews and Christians, very few people today know about it. So what is the Book of Enoch and what does it really say?
The book that history almost swallowed. There are books that shape the world quietly, working beneath the surface of more famous texts, leaving fingerprints everywhere without ever getting credit. The Book of Enoch is one of them. It sits at an unusual crossing point between history and legend, between scholarship and faith.
There were books that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were not canonized into what would be considered the Christian Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, that's right.
Between what made it into the Bible and what got left outside the door. Academics have studied it seriously for decades. Faith communities have wrestled with it for centuries. And in the past few years, it has found an entirely new audience, with YouTube videos pulling tens of millions of views, podcasters dedicating hours to its contents.
But it's an original biblical text, or at least a part of the original religious text that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And online communities debating its implications with genuine intensity. The text is attributed to Enoch, a figure who appears in Genesis in just a handful of verses. He is the great-grandfather of Noah, and more unusually, one of the only figures in the Hebrew Bible who does not die in the conventional sense. Genesis states simply that he walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. That compressed and quietly extraordinary exit made Enoch a natural figure for later writers to build upon. If God took him directly, the reasoning went, then perhaps he had seen things no ordinary human could access. The Book of Enoch is the record of what he supposedly saw. Scholars place its composition between roughly 300 BCE and the early centuries of the Common Era, meaning it was not written all at once by a single author. It arrived in stages, built across generations, shaped by communities who used Enoch's name to give their visions authority. This practice, known as pseudepigrapha, was entirely common in the ancient world. It was not deception so much as a literary convention, a way of grounding new ideas in the weight of a respected name. What makes the text remarkable is not just its content, but the trajectory of its survival. Nearly every branch of Judaism and most Christian denominations eventually excluded it. The one major exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has preserved it as genuine scripture throughout its entire history, treating it with the same standing given to Genesis or the Psalms. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773, carrying 3 complete manuscripts, he reintroduced a text that the Western world had largely forgotten existed.
The Ethiopian Bible ranges from 72 books to 81 books, although sometimes counted as 88 books, depending on the canon.
What scholars found inside those manuscripts made the exclusion suddenly seem like a story worth examining. Why researchers pointed an AI at an ancient text. For most of its modern history, serious engagement with the Book of Enoch required a very specific kind of expertise. Reading it well meant understanding Second Temple Judaism, ancient Aramaic and Hebrew, the religious traditions of Mesopotamia and Greece, the history of early Christianity, and the political landscape of several centuries all at once. That combination of requirements meant the text remained largely inside academic circles, discussed in papers that most people would never encounter. The Joe Rogan podcast segment that brought Grok's analysis to a wider public captured something real about why that was changing. The specific claim that drew attention was that AI could now do something human readers could not do efficiently at scale: move simultaneously across large bodies of ancient text, map repeated phrases, trace numerical patterns, identify structural echoes, and surface connections between documents that individual researchers might spend careers working toward. Grok, developed by XAI and launched in late 2023, was applied to the Book of Enoch with exactly this in mind. The research team was not attempting to produce a new translation or settle theological questions. They were asking the tool to do what it does best: find patterns that human readers, working one text at a time, are structurally unlikely to catch. Public reactions split in the way these things tend to split. Mystics and alternative history communities treated it as confirmation of things they had long suspected. Skeptics asked whether running an ancient religious text through a modern AI amounted to anything more than high-tech pattern matching applied to material that required historical and cultural judgment, not just computation. Both reactions are understandable, and neither fully settles the question of what the analysis actually produced. What it produced, it turns out, was detailed enough to warrant taking seriously. The 5 worlds inside one book. Before getting to what Grok found, it helps to understand that the Book of Enoch is not a single unified narrative. It is 5 distinct texts gathered under one name, each with its own tone, purpose, and vision of the cosmos. The first section, known as the Book of the Watchers, covers chapters 1 through 36 and contains the narrative most people encounter first. It describes 200 heavenly beings called the Watchers who abandon their posts, descend to earth, and take human wives. Their children are the Nephilim, described as giants, whose appetite for violence reshapes the world before the flood. Enoch functions here as a messenger, carrying pleas between the condemned Watchers and the divine court. The court's response is firm. The Watchers are bound in darkness to await final judgment, and their plea is denied. The moral the text draws is direct. Even beings of light, given purpose and position, can abandon what they were made for. The second section, the Book of Parables, shifts the tone entirely. Chapters 37 through 71 move from the drama of fallen angels into sweeping prophecy. A mysterious figure called the Son of Man appears, described as a pre-existent divine judge named before creation, destined to appear at the end of history in a throne room above the clouds, the wicked face reckoning. The righteous inherit a kingdom built on fairness. The imagery is grand and deliberate, built to carry weight across generations. The third section, running from chapters 72 through 82, reads more like a technical document than religious writing. Called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, it walks through the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with careful precision, presenting a 364-day solar calendar and framing celestial mechanics as divine schedule. The universe here is a precision machine, and every gate the sun passes through, every path the moon follows, operates according to laws that exist beyond human making. The fourth section covers chapters 83 through 90 and presents 2 visions. The first describes the flood in graphic detail. The second, known as the Animal Apocalypse, recounts the entire sweep of biblical history through animal allegory, with different nations and peoples represented by different creatures. It closes with hope for a renewed and just kingdom. The fifth section, chapters 91 through 108, is framed as a letter from an elder to future generations. It returns to themes of integrity, humility, and mercy, blending encouragement with warnings, and closes with apocalyptic imagery of final battles and a renewed earth. 5 different visions, bound together under one name, covering history, astronomy, prophecy, and ethics in a single text. Grok worked across all of it simultaneously. The hidden prints that AI surfaced. Among the specific findings that drew the most attention from the research team, one centered on Chapter 18, and the figure it names as the Prince of the Fallen Angels. The name that appears is Satanael. Grok's cross-textual analysis identified the phrase in Chapter 18, and then immediately traced its connection to Chapter 7, where the phrase describing the Watchers acting with their prince uses language that mirrors the Chapter 18 passage closely enough to be deliberate. The structural connection ties the Watcher narrative directly to the broader tradition of a leading angelic figure who chose rebellion, linking the story of the fallen Watchers to what later traditions would develop into the figure of Satan. What made this finding more significant was what the AI found when it extended the analysis outward. In the scene where imprisoned angels bow before Enoch, the researchers recognized an echo of a motif that appears in other early Jewish and mystical texts. In some traditions within early Jewish thought, the fall of a leading angel is connected to a refusal to honor humanity, specifically a refusal to bow before Adam. Here, the Watchers do bow before Enoch, and the text frames that act as an admission of guilt rather than an honor. The connections extended further. A later Jewish mystical text called Third Enoch, also known as the Sefer Hechelot, recasts Enoch as the archangel Metatron, a figure of enormous authority before whom angelic leaders bow. The names of some of those bowing angels in Third Enoch, including Uzzah and Azza, closely resemble the names of Watcher chiefs in First Enoch. The scholar Gary Anderson has argued that this bowing motif traces all the way back to the earliest stories about Adam, suggesting that the Book of Enoch is not drawing from random traditions, but is actively engaged in a long conversation with Adamic mythology. Grok mapped all of these phrase-level connections simultaneously, across texts from different centuries and different traditions, and surfaced a web of relationships that would have taken individual researchers years to chart manually. The conclusion the team drew was careful but pointed. The Book of Enoch is an active dialogue with a much older tradition of stories about the boundary between angels and humanity, and that dialogue left specific, traceable marks in the language of the text. The angels or something else entirely. Any discussion of the Book of Enoch is not complete without mentioning one popular idea, even though it is quite different from what most scholars believe. This idea is called the ancient alien interpretation. It suggests that the Watchers described in the book were not angels, but real physical beings, advanced visitors from another world. According to this view, these visitors came to Earth long ago, met early humans, and shared knowledge such as metalworking, astronomy, and even warfare. In this explanation, the Nephilim were not the result of a spiritual event, but were the offspring of two different species. Supporters of this theory point to certain details in the text. For example, the book mentions bright lights in the sky, a fiery chariot that carries Enoch through the heavens, and surprisingly, detailed knowledge about stars and their movements. These descriptions, they argue, could be understood in a physical, scientific way instead of a purely spiritual one. However, critics strongly disagree. They argue that this idea underestimates human ability. Ancient people were capable of building impressive structures, studying the stars, and developing important skills over long periods of time without outside help. From this point of view, the Book of Enoch is simply using symbolic and religious storytelling. The Watchers represent a way to explain big changes in human life, such as new knowledge, suffering, and moral problems. Some researchers take a middle position. They believe the Watchers are symbolic figures representing outside influence, whether supernatural, cultural, or something else. These stories help explain where harmful knowledge and human struggles come from, no matter how one chooses to interpret the beings involved. The Son of Man and the Gospel connection. Of everything the AI surfaced across the full text of the Book of Enoch, the findings that carry the most direct weight for understanding the New Testament center on the figure called the Son of Man in the Book of Parables. This is not a vague thematic connection. The description of the Son of Man in chapters 37 through 71 is specific and detailed, He is named by God before the world was created. He is righteous, chosen, and seated on a throne of glory. He appears at the end of history to judge both humanity and the fallen angels. He acts on God's behalf, calls out wrongs, and raises up the righteous. In the four Gospels, Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man to refer to himself approximately 80 times. It is the title he reaches for most consistently across contexts ranging from descriptions of his daily ministry to dramatic statements about his coming in glory. New Testament scholars have spent generations debating exactly what the phrase meant and where it came from. Some have pointed to Daniel 7 as the primary source. Others have argued it was a relatively humble self-description that Jesus gave distinctive content. Grok placed the Enochic Son of Man directly alongside the Gospel usages and found that the match is not approximate. The specific combination of pre-existence, divine appointment before creation, role as judge, and appearance in glory at the end of history aligns in ways that are precise rather than general. The text that carries this description predates the Gospels by at least 2 centuries. This finding does not resolve the theological questions surrounding Jesus or what he understood himself to be. What it does is clarify the context in which the title resonated. If the communities hearing Jesus use this phrase were familiar with Enoch's vision of the Son of Man, which the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence suggests was quite likely for many of them, then the phrase carried a specific and loaded set of associations that go largely invisible to modern readers who have never encountered the Enochic background. The key difference the research team noted is also worth holding on to. In Enoch's vision, judgment falls for breaking moral law and harming others. There is no atoning sacrifice, no question of accepting or rejecting a particular figure. Mercy extends even to those outside Israel. The judgment framework in Enoch is older and in some ways broader than what the New Testament develops from it, suggesting that the later tradition reshaped what it inherited rather than simply repeating it. The calendar that split a community. The section of Grok's analysis that generated the least immediate drama was, in some ways, the most historically concrete. The Book of the Heavenly Luminaries presents a 364-day solar calendar divided into 4 equal seasons. Archangel Uriel serves as Enoch's guide through the celestial mechanics, explaining how the sun rises through 6 eastern doors and sets through 6 western doors, how the moon receives its light from the sun on the western side and transfers it across a monthly cycle, and how the stars follow the same gates to create the rhythm of seasons that agricultural communities depended on. The astronomy embedded here reflects careful, long-term observation of the sky. The text demonstrates awareness of equinoxes, solstices, and the gap between solar and lunar years that creates the drift anyone who has followed both calendars will recognize. This is not speculative cosmology. It is the result of people watching the sky systematically over time and writing down what they found in a framework that treated that observation as sacred knowledge. Grok's analysis placed this section directly alongside what is known about the Essenes, the community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. The Essenes used a 364-day solar calendar, and their insistence on it was one of the defining points of conflict between their community and the Jerusalem temple establishment, which followed a lunar calendar. Festivals fell on different days. Sabbaths were calculated differently. The conflict was not abstract. It shaped who could worship where and when. If the Essenes drew their calendar authority from the Book of Enoch, which the Qumran evidence strongly implies, then the text was functioning as something more than religious literature for that community. It was a practical governing document, determining the structure of sacred time. Their calendar dispute with Jerusalem was, at its root, a dispute about whose vision of cosmic order was correct. The archaeology that settles the presence question. Whatever position one takes on the Book of Enoch's theological status or interpretive questions, one category of evidence is not in dispute. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran beginning in 1947, more than 20 fragments of the Book of Enoch were recovered. They were written in Aramaic and Hebrew and dated to between 200 and 100 BCE. For comparison, some books that appear in every modern Bible are represented by fewer copies at Qumran than the Book of Enoch is. This is the profile of a text that was central to at least one major Jewish community during precisely the period when the foundations of both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were being laid. The people who stored these scrolls in desert caves did not treat the Book of Enoch as fringe material or historical curiosity. They copied it repeatedly, preserved it carefully, and placed it alongside texts they considered authoritative. The letter of Jude in the New Testament quotes Enoch 1:9 directly, using language close enough to be unmistakable. The Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment. That quotation appears in a canonical New Testament letter without explanation or introduction, suggesting the author expected the audience to recognize the source. You do not quote a text that nobody knows. The presence of that quotation in Jude tells us that the Book of Enoch was familiar enough to the early Christian communities to be cited as a recognizable authority. Why it never made the cut. Given all of this, the question the research team placed at the center of their inquiry becomes more pressing. If the Book of Enoch was this widely known, this clearly influential, and this directly connected to texts that did enter both the Jewish and Christian canons, why was it excluded? The answer does not reduce to a single decision. After the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, rabbinic authorities worked to stabilize Jewish scripture around a defined and defensible set of texts. The Book of Enoch's elaborate angel hierarchy, its origin story for evil spirits, its 364-day calendar that stood in direct conflict with temple practice, and its dramatic vision of a pre-existent divine judge would all have presented complications for a community working to rebuild religious identity after catastrophic loss. Early Christian councils made their own decisions across the following centuries. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and the Council of Carthage in 397 CE helped define the shape of the Christian Bible in its Western form. Church fathers and rabbis who reviewed the Book of Enoch encountered a text that blended history, prophecy, astronomy, and mythic narrative in ways that were difficult to categorize. They needed texts with clear connections to eyewitnesses and to the documented history of God's engagement with Israel. Enoch, for all its power, had a background that was too layered and too contested to fit cleanly into those requirements. The recommendation that has emerged from several scholars, including those involved in the current research, is worth considering. The Book of Enoch works best as background material, a way of enriching understanding of the canonical texts rather than replacing or competing with them. Where it echoes Scripture, it deepens it. Where it diverges, it signals that ancient communities were actively wrestling with questions that the canonical texts leave open. What the AI cannot answer. The research team was direct about the limits of what this analysis could actually establish, and those limits deserve clear acknowledgement. Grok identified patterns. It mapped connections between texts, surfaced structural echoes, and flagged areas where the Book of Enoch and canonical scripture appear to be in sustained conversation with each other across centuries. It cannot verify whether the events the text describes actually occurred. It cannot confirm whether the cosmological vision it presents is accurate. It cannot settle the theological questions that communities of faith have been working through for 2,000 years. There is also the translation issue. Grok worked from English translations of the Book of Enoch rather than from the original Aramaic and Hebrew. Translation always carries the accumulated choices of the scholars who produced it, and centuries of interpretive decisions are embedded in the available English texts. The patterns the analysis found are real patterns in those translations. Whether they emerge with the same clarity from the primary languages is a question that requires specialists working directly with the original sources. What the analysis offers is a well-organized starting point. It is a map of connections and questions, produced at a scale and speed that human researchers working individually could not match, and it points toward areas that deserve deeper investigation. The findings are genuine. The conclusions they support remain appropriately open. The Book of Enoch has spent 2,000 years at the edge of history, familiar to scholars, invisible to almost everyone else. Grok did not close the questions surrounding it. It clarified what the text says, where it connects, and what it might mean that those connections were overlooked for so long. That alone is worth sitting with. If these are the kinds of questions that matter to you, subscribe and stay with us for what we uncover next.